Em, entonces, como última ponente del día, tengo el placer de presentaros a Louisa Allen, profesora en la Facultad de Educación y Trabajo Social en la Universidad de Auckland, en Nueva Zelanda. Louisa no está con nosotras hoy porque vive en Nueva Zelanda, entonces son las 5 de la mañana y nos ha hecho el favor de grabar su presentación para que la podamos proyectar. Luisa lleva casi 25 años investigando temas relacionados con la juventud, la educación y la sexualidad, con el objetivo de explorar los mensajes que reciben los estudiantes a través de la educación oficial y no oficial sobre el género y las identidades sexuales. En su trabajo se ha interesado en cómo las escuelas pueden ser entendidas como espacios heteronormativos en los que las identidades queer quedan marginalizadas. Luisa explora de qué forma la educación y la cultura educativa pueden ser más inclusivas en relación a la diversidad sexual, de género, religiosa y cultural, y cómo podemos abordar lo relativo a la sexualidad de una forma que pueda ser significativa para los jóvenes. Tal y como lo escucharéis en su ponencia, uno de los temas que ha explorado es la cuestión de un discurso mayoritariamente ausente en los programas oficiales de educación sexual, el del deseo del placer, y cómo los jóvenes perciben su contenido.
Greetings everyone, it's my great pleasure to be here with you this evening, and I'm just going to try and share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I have prepared. Let's go back. It's wonderful to join you from New Zealand. I have always wanted to go to Spain. I hope one day, once this pandemic is over, that I will finally get to go there and maybe get to give a presentation in person. But for this evening, it's just great to join you at this fabulous conference that's looking at comprehensive sexuality education, gender and sexuality. And what I hope to offer tonight is a discussion about pleasure in sexuality education, particularly for secondary school students. So the inclusion of desire and pleasure have been a really important and often a controversial vision for sexuality education for the past at least 30 years, ever since Michelle Fine's important discussion about the missing discourse of desire in sexuality education in America. So Michelle Fine has identified that desire is missing in secondary schools in America, and she talks about the fact that desire is a whisper in the corridors of schools, but it's not actually a legitimate part of the schooling curriculum. And she's talked about this since 1988. And the excerpt that I give you here actually comes from a book, a reiteration a few years later. So she says that the naming of desire, pleasure, or sexual entitlement, particularly for females, Fine is a feminist, barely exists in the formal agenda of public schooling on sexuality. And when it is spoken about, it's always tagged with reminders of consequences that are emotional, physical, moral, reproductive, or financial. So there's never any talk in sexuality education that talks about pleasure as something that young people might experience in a positive way. So some of the ways in which this discourse is a concept that comes from post-structuralism, and it means sets of meanings of things. So this missing set of meanings around desire and pleasure. One of the ways those are expressed in sexuality education, and this is just one example here, a small example, is often in the diagrams that we give young people to explain their bodies. And typically these diagrams are labelled as this one is, the female reproductive organs. You'll notice that they're not the female sexual organs or the female pleasure organs, but they're labelled in a way that very much focuses reproduction and things that aren't sexual. Interestingly, in this particular diagram, there is the clitoris that is labelled, which suggests there could be pleasure and desire talked about here, but this is quite rare, and that it would be talked about by teachers in classrooms, especially in the New Zealand context and other places around the world. I show it to you, I suppose, in hope that these discussions might occur, but the missing discourse of desire and pleasure is evident here in the very kind of medicalized version of bodies that we've got. We've got a dissected image of the female body. There's no sense of it being fleshed or infleshed and sensual in any way. The example for male reproductive organs is exactly the same. It's line drawn, it's desexualized, the penis is not shown erect, which might suggest desire, and it's very medicalized. So we can see in those particular diagrams this missing discourse of desire. And that, as I said, is just one example. There are many others. So others have taken up this call internationally since FINE to look for the missing discourse of desire and pleasure in sexuality education. And following FINE, a group of researchers in the UK, the Women, Risk and AIDS Project, that's the first reference there, Holland and colleagues, they also identified the missing discourse of desire and pleasure in sexuality education. Since then, Harrison, Hillier and Walsh in Australia have also identified the discourse as missing. And Rasmussen and colleagues also in Australia have identified this particularly for queer students, those who are LGBTIQA+, and the way in which a discourse of desire is doubly missing for those students. It's not talked about at all because their identities are often not, and issues that are important to them are often not included within sexuality education. Other researchers in Ireland, that's McGinney, Fars in the US, and more recently, this work around the missing discourse of pleasure in sexuality education has come from places like Africa and India. So the very latest research in this area is found in those particular countries. And the inclusion, the arguments that these particular researchers make for the inclusion of pleasure in sexuality education are around the fact that when we leave out pleasure, we're not presenting the whole picture of sexuality to young people. By leaving out pleasure, we're narrowing sexuality to a very reproductive and heteronormative approach. And of course, this is problematic in that it doesn't embrace all sexual diversity. It's focusing solely on heterosexual students and marginalizing other identities. Another argument for the inclusion of pleasure made by these researchers is that it might actually be helpful to know about pleasure in order to negotiate sexual activity better in ways that are more advantageous for yourself. So for instance, Deborah Tolman in Canada has talked about the way in her study, young women, when she interviewed them about their first sexual experiences, she said, you know, did you enjoy your first sexual experience? And most of the young women were ambivalent about it. They kind of thought, well, it wasn't terribly good, but it wasn't terribly bad. And so in her analysis of those interviews, Tolman suggests that if those young women had had a better sense of what desire is and how it feels and what pleasure is, that could have acted as a gauge for them to decide whether or not they did want to engage in sexual activity. And so those first experiences might have been much more positive because they had a better sense of what they wanted and what they desired and what they knew would be pleasurable. Another argument for the inclusion of pleasure in sexuality education is that the concentration on danger that currently exists in these programs doesn't resonate with young people's knowledge about sexuality that they get from the internet, from digital platforms, from social platforms, from television, from pop songs. It kind of jars with what they know that sexuality can be, and that it can be pleasurable. And so what happens when they sit in the sexuality education classroom and hear only the messages of danger and negative things that can go wrong is that they can switch off, because it doesn't speak to their own experiences, lived experiences of what sexuality might be. So including pleasure in sexuality education might actually be a way of hooking young people into actually listen more to other messages that sexuality education offers, opening them to listen to and be part of and engage with sexuality education, rather than closing them off with simply offering them negative messages. So all of these arguments so far about why pleasure might be important to include in sexuality education have been made by adults. And in my own research, I've been really interested over the years to understand what young people think about pleasure. Do they want pleasure to be part of the curriculum? And what do they see as the potential challenges of teaching about pleasure? And so I set up a project to really concentrate on young people's perspectives in this regard. And it was gathering these perspectives was part of a broader project where I was designing a sexuality education resource for students in their last 2 years of secondary school. So these students were about 16, 17 years old. And I used two methods in that research. One was a questionnaire and one was focus groups. Also, actually, no, it's 3 methods. I also used individual interviews to find out what young people thought would be important content to include in that resource. And as part of the questionnaire, the young people who were involved in this research came from 15 schools throughout New Zealand. They came from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds and regional locations. And they also reflected the composition of the youth population at the time that the research was conducted. So they're fairly representative of young people at that time. There was over 1,000 of them as part of this research. And one of the questions in the questionnaire asked them to consider which issues they would like included in the sexuality education resource that I was going to design. And these issues had been put together from previous research that I had done with teachers and young people, where they gave ideas about what they thought should be included. And I categorized these issues under headings like puberty, reproduction, sex and risk, sex and relationships, sex and society. And one of those particular issues was how to make sexual activity enjoyable for both partners. You can see it highlighted there. And that particular issue ranked the top of the 5 most wanted issues to be included in the resource. And it's really interesting that there was a significant difference between young men and young women, with more young men wanting to know how to make sexual activity enjoyable for both partners. So that could actually be a presentation in its own right. And I encourage you, maybe after I finish speaking, to actually think about why it might be that young men wanted to know more about how to make sexual activity enjoyable than young women, because I think there's some interesting things to consider there in relation to gender and why that might be the case. So clearly, the questionnaire indicated that pleasure was an important topic for inclusion for young people in this research. And then the second method, which was focus groups, these also indicated that pleasure was something that young people were very interested and invested in. And those are the demographics there on the screen for the young people who were involved in this part of the research. They came from the same schools as those who were part of the questionnaire. Now, in the focus groups, what I did was take the issues that had come from the questionnaire, these issues here, including the one highlighted there, how to make sexual activity enjoyable for both partners. And I asked young people to consider whether or not these topics had been covered, if they'd been covered in sexuality education, whether they've been covered poorly, or whether they've been covered well. And so students could put these issues into piles and talk about which piles they should go into, either not addressed, poorly addressed, or well addressed in sexuality education. And it was in the course of deciding where these particular issues should go that more conversation about pleasure and young people's investment in pleasure emerged. And I'm going to share with you one discussion from a focus group that involved young men and women from a high decile school. So the students were middle class here. And so this is Harry and Zoe, who were talking about the card, how to make sexual activity enjoyable for both partners. So Harry goes, this one here, picking up the card. I know you guys are all going to laugh at me, but and Zoe, his friend, goes, no, we won't. Harry goes, how to make sexual activity enjoyable for both partners. But if that's sort of like a popular answer, what are you going to do? And he's talking to me here. Are you going to turn around and say, this is how you do this to stimulate that and that kind of stuff? So I say, I don't know, would that be useful? And Harry goes, I mean, God, and then he laughed. And I sense his hesitation here, and I say to him, no, go on, say it. And Harry goes, oh, like for me, I'd love to know about that stuff. And Zoe says, I'd like to know about that stuff too. And Harry goes, oh, sweet. And I think that here, Harry's opening remark, I know you guys are all going to laugh at me, acknowledges that displaying a serious kind of interest in sexual pleasure risks a certain amount of ridicule from his peers. But he really was interested in this topic, like many of the young men in the research and young women. And so he's willing to risk that ridicule and show himself to be not knowledgeable, and in a way not macho, in order to make sure that that issue might be included in the resource that I was putting together. So it does show young people's significant investment in knowing about pleasure. There was one more piece of research that I did just before the development of the sexuality education resource, and that involved interviewing, it was a part of a separate project, and it involved interviewing young couples who had been in relationships together. And these young couples invariably also talked about pleasure. And there's an example here on the screen where Peter and Amy, they had been together for about 6 years, I think, and they'd had their first sexual experience of sexual intercourse together. And they both talked about the fact that they realized that if they had been given a little bit more information about sexual pleasure and positionings, you know, Peter says, just like the basics, like positioning or whatever, something like that, it would have made their sexual experience more pleasurable and would have made it easier. Interestingly, I interviewed these couples together, but then I also interviewed them individually after I'd interviewed them together. And Peter said in that interview, when I spoke with him, that his first sexual experience actually hadn't really been anything like he imagined it was going to be. It wasn't like in the movies. It wasn't amazing, because of the fact that he felt that he needed to know more about how to please his partner and Amy herself in her individual interview said something similar. It would have been better if we were more knowledgeable, if sexuality education had prepared us better. And so these two young people were people who were, you know, very interested in and very knowledgeable already, but still didn't know much about pleasure and would have really appreciated having their teachers been open with them about this particular topic. So just to summarise, young people's reasons for wanting to have pleasure included in sexuality education were mainly because they'd had poor or no coverage at school. Pleasure was largely missing from the curriculum, or if it was included, it was included in a negative way. It was portrayed as something that was bad. So pleasure or desire could lead to negative consequences of sexual activity, like sexually transmissible infections or unplanned pregnancies or those sorts of things. So for these young people in these particular research projects that I've undertaken, pleasure is not just, including pleasure is not just about filling a gap in the curriculum, but it's suggesting a more positive and comprehensive approach to this issue. So while wanting to talk or know more about sexual pleasure and sexuality education, some participants expressed ambivalence about how pleasure could be taught. And this was related to the fact that they felt that some members of their community, their school community, would be opposed to the inclusion of pleasure in programs. And they recognised that those people, often the board of the ruling those who rule in schools at a managerial kind of level, in New Zealand they're called the Board of Trustees. Those people have a lot of control over what actually gets taught. And they recognise that they might not want pleasure included, and that would mean that young people would not get pleasure included in sexuality education even if they wanted to. In New Zealand, for instance, the Education and Training Act 2020 offers parents and caregivers an opportunity to write to the principal to have their child removed from any component of sexuality education that they don't want them to hear or be a part of, and that could include a unit on pleasure. So young people recognise that while this was their wish, it might not happen because of certain factions of the school community. Another of young people's considerations in teaching about pleasure was the issue of embarrassment. So for some of the students, talking about how you get turned on was much too intimate and risky a discussion to have in front of their peers. And they were worried that that discussion also would reveal confidential insights about themselves, for instance, whether they'd had sexual activity or not. And they feared that their questions or the discussion that they had might mean that they would be judged or treated differently by their peers and teachers. And this was especially a concern for young people who identified as LGBTIQA+ and were not out to their teachers and peers. They felt, those students expressed a sense of vulnerability around whether or not this discussion of pleasure would out them. And then that could increase homophobic comments or discrimination against them. Also, young people were worried about their teachers and the embarrassment that their teachers might feel having to teach about these topics. They thought that some teachers were just not really well prepared to be able to talk about pleasure and desire in a way that wouldn't make themselves incredibly embarrassed, that is, a teacher themselves. And this actually is found in research that Debbie Honest has done in Australia with pre-service teachers. where she's found that those teachers often say, we can't teach about this particular issue because we just don't have the confidence. We haven't had enough training, and it would just be too difficult to do for those reasons. So what do we know about the experience of teaching about pleasure when it is actually included in sexuality education? And there is a concern that has been expressed in the existing literature that pleasure might become a new imperative in sexuality education. So when the teacher talks about pleasure, it's cast as this kind of ideal in sexual relations that young people feel compelled to achieve, or that young people might start to judge themselves by, because the teacher would say, well, sexual activity can be pleasurable, and then some young people who hadn't experienced pleasure in sexual activity might think, well, you know, what's wrong with me? I haven't experienced pleasure before. What am I doing wrong? So original calls for including pleasure have always been about the presence of a discussion about pleasure in the curriculum, and that pleasure is represented as a legitimate possibility. It's about pleasure being a potential topic of conversation, not that pleasure should be this new imperative that must be talked about and that young people must feel compelled to experience in sexual activity. The other thing that we know about the inclusion of pleasure when it's been taught in sexuality education is sometimes it can get put to work for particular agendas. And an example of this was once when I went to a conference a couple of years ago. We were in the break time and someone came up to me. They were an educator from a faith-based organisation. And they said, oh, thank you for that article that you wrote about including pleasure and sexuality education. It's been so useful to me in my work. I've been able to tell the students in my class that they shouldn't engage in sexual activity until they're married and only with someone of the opposite gender, because it won't be pleasurable. And I remember thinking, my goodness, that wasn't really what I had imagined when I'd been talking about the possibility of including pleasure in sexuality education. So I think it's really important to recognise that including pleasure in sexuality education doesn't mean that it will do the things that we as educators or researchers necessarily want it to, and that we need to recognise that, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it, but that pleasure, when we talk about it, will do things that we may not, or young people will do things with the thing, and other people will do things with the things we offer them, information we offer them about pleasure that we hadn't expected. So in this last part now of the presentation, I just wanted to think about, for those of you who might be sitting in the audience online and wanting to include pleasure in the programs or teaching that you do, how might you do this? And some of the things that I would suggest are pretty typical of what is necessary really to teach well. And that is, if you're going to include pleasure in your education program, then it's really important to know your students and to ask them if this is an inclusion that they want. And it's really important, I think, as well, to ensure that when you talk about pleasure, that it doesn't become the new imperative, a new imperative for students. And the way that we can try to ensure that this doesn't happen is to follow, and the way I try and do it in my own teaching, not simply in sexuality education, but in all types of teaching, but it works, I think, also around topics like pleasure, is to follow the work of Kevin Kumashiro, who's pictured there, and his principles for anti-oppressive education. And Kevin suggests that after every lesson that we've given as teachers, for instance, after the lessons that we've given about pleasure, we might ask ourselves the questions here that are up on the screen. So what assumptions did I make about who the students are and what they feel and what they're open to discussing in relation to pleasure? And I'll let you read the rest of those, but the bottom point there is, were the discussion framed differently about pleasure? What different contributions, debates and feelings and insights might have resulted? And the importance of asking those kinds of questions is to open up discussion about pleasure in ways that recognise diverse approaches to it, diverse understandings and relationships to it. In finishing, I want to leave you with a final thought, and that is that the inclusion of pleasure in sexuality education continues to be seen as a controversial issue. Its inclusion in the curriculum really deserves careful treatment. And this is not because of the controversy that it might cause, because it often does cause controversy, but because students deserve a sexuality education that speaks to who they are and what matters to them in the here and now. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a list of further resources for those of you who are interested in exploring this area further. And I really want to wish you all the very best for the next days of the conference. And thank you for listening. Go well, everybody. Okay, bye.